Starting on the first day of medical school, we started dissecting our cadaver, and which was, I found, a very fascinating process, maybe the most enlightening of my life, cutting open another dead human. I'm not interested in these foods or promoting them for the gross factor, oh, isn't it gross that you're eating this animal's tongue or heart or brain? Because it's not gross, it's just that some people might not be used to it. At some of our Anatomy Eats dinners, I'll actually dissect the heart while people are eating a heart dish, anything from pancreas to testicles to brain. When people ask me, well, what do I think is the best diet? I'm actually surprised they want to hear from me because doctors have been so wrong about nutrition in the past. I'm curious who actually wants to hear from a doctor about what nutritional facts they learned in medical school, because they're probably wrong based on terrible science.
All right, I'm here very happy to have our guest today, Dr. Jonathan Reisman. He's from Pennsylvania, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's an ER physician, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. I trained as an internist and pediatrician. I did a med peds residency, but I worked in the ER basically my whole career.
Gotcha. And then you said, I saw something here, a foodie, anatomy, dissecting cadaver made you a foodie. I'm interested how that came to be.
Yes, I grew up not really being interested in food, not cooking much. Maybe I learned to make a stir fry in college. I guess that was the extent of my food know-how. But starting on the first day of medical school, we started dissecting our cadaver, and which was, I found, a very fascinating process, maybe the most enlightening of my life, cutting open another dead human. But one of the professors liked pointing out which muscles in the cadaver in humans corresponded to which cuts of beef. And that got me interested in learning more about that. And I visited some slaughterhouses, started learning how to butcher. And then that led into my interest in all foods, anatomical and otherwise.
That's interesting. I'll tell you a funny story. When I was doing my orthopedic surgical residency, we were doing our spine training. We were doing all these back surgeries. I remember it'd be long surgeries, and you literally be hungry, and you see they're dissecting out basically the back strap, but it looks like a fillet. I was just kind of thinking about that. She just cannibalism is a little bit, but it's just amazing. We're basically made out of red meat that humans don't, which is interesting.
And when surgeons use the electrocautery, the bovie, it can sometimes smell burnt or cooking meat in the operating room.
Yeah, it doesn't smell that nice. I bovie now. I did a lot of bovie years. I don't remember smiling, you made a mistake. But yeah, it does have a scent, but it's not something I would say tastes that good. It smells like it. Let me ask you, you med peds, went into the ER, obviously interested in food and how it's produced and what it does, but how has that impacted you? Where are you at these days?
So in general, I have my job as an ER doctor where I'm not generally doing too much counseling. I do some counseling on nutrition and food intake and other things, but often I'm just patching up the acute injury and then sending people back to their primary care doctors. But in my own personal life, my interest in food and anatomy and the overlap between sort of medical knowledge and food knowledge has impacted the way I eat and what I'm interested in eating, the recipes I might seek out especially when traveling to another country, exploring another cuisine, or even within the US, we have so many varied cuisines from Northeast to South and West. And so just exploring all those cuisines is a big part of my life, a big interest, and led me to create Anatomy Eats, this dinner series where we promote eating all parts of an animal's body, every part of which is edible and nutritious. I'm not an expert in nutrition, but I like the fascinating aspect of eating these interesting body parts, knowing from my medical education what they do in living humans and living animals, how they function inside of us, and how that incredibly complex biochemical function, or whatever the function of that particular body part is, you're eating that same substance that carries out that sort of almost miraculous function to keep us and animals alive. So that sort of interest led me to be forever exploring cuisine and how different cultures around the world and around the country have cooked these different body parts. So it certainly impacted my own life in that way.
There's the old saying, you are what you eat, or you eat what you are in some ways, because we look at what we're made of. If we're made of animal cells, and I make the argument that animal cells have what animal cells need. You go from the structure standpoint anyway.
Makes sense.
So how is that? So what would be some of the, I guess, people would consider maybe unusual thing, so bizarre, great? I remember there was a guy, I can't remember his name, but used to go around the world eating just the weirdest crap. It was just like, some like quite awesome. Kind of quite disgusting, but I can't remember that. Andrew Summit or something like that.
Andrew Zimmer, I think that was bizarre.
Yeah. Bald head guy. Yeah, he was doing that stuff. But, so what have you discovered that maybe most people don't understand or know?
Sure. And I do think that's an important point, that I'm not interested in these foods or promoting them for the gross factor. Oh, isn't it gross that you're eating this animal's tongue or heart or brain? Because it's not gross. It's just that some people might not be used to it. Those who grew up eating these body parts or in cuisines where it's a common ingredient in food don't find it gross at all, hardly find it any different than regular meat, which is perhaps more familiar to most Americans. It's not that it's gross, it's that it shouldn't be gross, or that it actually isn't gross. Instead, it's fascinating to eat these parts. So I even from, let's say, liver, I feel like if you ask the average American who does not eat any internal organs or offal, liver might be the thing they're the most familiar with as something that is eaten. So I grew up with people around me eating liver, though I actually thought it was gross as a kid. I didn't like the taste. I didn't like the thought. I didn't like anything about it. But then after I went to med school and learned a million and one things about the liver and how amazing it is as an organ to keep us alive, got me reinterested in trying it. And then I did try it and I grew to love it. Even something like that's a super common internal organ that people are familiar with, might see in the grocery store, to, let's say, the heart, which is quite striking. At some of our Anatomy Eats dinners, I'll actually dissect the heart while people are eating a heart dish, cut it open, show them the ventricles, the valves, how it beats, where the coronary arteries are that feed the heart muscle blood. Even something like that can be very startling for the average person who gets their food already cooked or perhaps butchered and wrapped in cellophane in the butcher portion of the grocery store or supermarket. Anything from that to, let's say, sweetbreads, which are the thymus gland, which is probably, I had a sweetbread dish in France last year, probably one of the most delicious things I've eaten in my life. Anything from pancreas to testicles to brain. At one of our Anatomy Eats dinners, we did a cardiovascular theme where the chef I was working with that time, Ari Miller, cooked 3 species of heart cooked in 3 different ways. So he made a beef heart tartare, pork heart skewers, and a chicken heart terrine, just to demonstrate how different animals obviously have different sized hearts, different shaped hearts, and they can be used in different ways to make different dishes. And there's really a lot of creativity that you can do based on some of these organs.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I know when I was in Iceland, I got to eat some quite strange things. I thought there were, I don't know if you've been there, they've got some interesting shark and some other bizarre testicles and all that fun stuff that I try to know. As a physician, and you said you're patching out people, one of the things I've discovered as an orthopedic surgeon, was how important nutrition played a role in either the improvement or the progression of disease, depending on how you're eating. And that's something that, that's what I do now. I talk about nutrition now in Back's Health. Is that something you get into much, or is it more just about keeping the novelty of eating? Sure, different things.
I would say I don't, in my job as an ER doctor, I don't get into nutrition a ton. I do, and in my personal life, I certainly think a lot of the nutritional knowledge I learned as a medical student, I don't believe anymore. And I think that evidence is clear that a lot of what I learned is wrong. So I like ingesting cholesterol, raises your cholesterol, or certain things about vilifying certain kinds of fat. I think nutritional science that I learned or that doctors talk to their patients about is often wrong. When people ask me, what do I think is the best diet? I'm actually surprised they want to hear from me because doctors have been so wrong about nutrition in the past. I'm curious who actually wants to hear from a doctor about what nutritional facts they learned in medical school, because they're probably wrong based on terrible science. For me, I think I guess my approach to nutrition is anything that any part of the body is edible, and any part, animal bodies, of course, not human, but any part of the body is nutritious as well. Like you said, we are made of the same stuff, so why wouldn't it help rebuild and help with the turnover of our own tissues if we're eating those same raw materials or raw ingredients? I certainly think eating any part of the body can be healthy. Even from an environmental standpoint, I think there's no reason to waste body parts that are edible, can be delicious, just because people, let's say in America, are just not used to eating them or don't see them as food, or often ask the question, can you eat that? And the answer is any part of the body can be eaten and can be nutritious. So it's definitely changed the way that I think about nutrition. I guess nutrition doesn't often come up in my conversations with patients unless, it's more like telling them to stick to a clear diet until they stop having diarrhea and things like that, sort of more short-term nutritional advice than really long-term.
Yeah, that's right. I suspect a lot of people present the their nutrition or all that stuff probably drove to this percent. Yeah,
I certainly think that's true.
So it sounds like, have you traveled extensively trying sampling? Once you mentioned France, have you gone to the butcheries and seen like stuff that we would never have heard of or even thought of here? I know I was in Malaysia, I had jellyfish, which I thought was really bizarre. I was like, I didn't know you could eat jellyfish. It was actually crunchy, which surprised me. I was surprised by that. And that stuff.
Yeah, I do travel. I'm working on a book based on Anatomy Eats. And so I have a few countries I still haven't gotten to that I need to explore the cuisine. But I've also been to Iceland, as you mentioned. They have some very interesting food preservation techniques that sometimes cause foods to have a lot of ammonia in them, like the pickled shark, the hakal that you talked about, which is, if you don't smell it, it's not too bad to put in your mouth. But you have to really try not to smell it. And then other things in Iceland, I really enjoyed that in Iceland. You can go to any general supermarket and buy whale blubber as a snack and slice thin and put on there. In Iceland, they love this dried fish called hartfisker that almost traditionally was a bread substitute because they can't really grow grain there. They would use dried fish fillets as something to spread butter or put whale blubber on top of, which I thought was pretty great. And had those ram testicles as well. I did spend a bunch of time in Russia, not in recent years, but after college, when I was younger, and tried some interesting foods there. I spent a bunch of time on the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Far East, where a lot of people, especially in the northern part of the peninsula, do a lot of salmon fishing and harvesting the caviar, the red caviar, which was very interesting. That'll be in the reproductive chapter of my Anatomy Eats book, which goes by system. It's eggs that you're eating, and also they would make spread out of the sperm from the male salmon, which is also called milt, M-I-L-T, which you can sometimes buy in stores, like from cod especially. And the milt, they would boil quickly. It was this long, sort of tubular cylindrical sack of white sperm. And when you boil it briefly, it hardens up, and then they would grind it with a little bit of chopped green onions and just add some salt. And it actually made a great spread on bread also. And many other foods too. I was in Spain recently exploring the cuisine there. And I guess one thing we're blessed with in America is that people bring their cuisines here. And while we might find them gross or disgusting, raw fish was gross 50 years ago. And then in the 80s and 90s, all the rich people started eating it. And now we all love it. But so a lot of interesting cuisines people bring to the US that we might not whet our appetites initially. Maybe we get used to it later. You can go to ethnic parts of various cities and explore cuisines almost without traveling, which is pretty great. If I go to Philadelphia nearby here and go to the Chinatown, I can pretty much get almost any body part in a grocery store or find it served on menus. And so that's a great way to explore as well.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I thought like some body parts you can't get in the US, like lung and stuff like that. I mean, I think there's some, I don't know if maybe they're worried about safety of that, or are there any issues with that? Would you say?
So you're right. Lungs is actually one that is illegal. In my book, I write about how that law came to be. So it was not a law debated in Congress, but it was a rule passed by the USDA in 1971. They wanted to invest, starting in the late 60s, there's some congressional records or government records about how they started wondering if lungs were safe to eat or healthy for humans to eat because of all the things people and animals inhale, like dust or fungal spores and pollen and other things like that. And the trouble with the lungs is it's this organ turned inside out where you can't really look into all the airways to inspect it for abnormalities or contaminants unless you cut it open and totally destroy it, unlike other organs where you can just observe them from the outside without shredding them to make sure they're healthy and should be in the food supply. So they cut open a bunch of lungs doing this USDA study that pathologists conducted and found a lot of these things in their lungs, in their airways, like dust and fungal spores. And because it's difficult to examine all the specimens and make sure they're healthy, they just said, we'll just make lungs completely illegal. Lungs stopped appearing in butcher shops, no longer appeared on any menus. And there's a bunch of recipes that certain ethnic groups in the US had that suddenly couldn't make anymore because lungs disappeared from the butcher shops. There's very few that are actually illegal. Lungs are one. The thyroid gland is another. The third, I only know these three, but a third one is a lactating udder. So you can serve or sell non-lactating udder as food. I've actually had that in France. They call it tétine de vache, or udder of a cow. But lactating udders, like full of milk, which sounds delicious perhaps, is not legal to sell in the US. But on the topic of lungs, I did submit a petition to the USDA last February, to overturn that 1971 rule, because I don't think it actually makes any medical or nutritional sense to keep people from eating lungs. As you can in almost every other advanced country in the world, except for Canada. Lungs are freely available in haggis in the UK and served in all over Asia in various traditional dishes. And nobody's coming down with anthrax as a result of eating it.
Okay, so that's why haggis is illegal in the US, correct? Because it has lungs.
They made some non-lung containing haggis products that you can buy in the US, but the traditional recipe with lungs is not available in the US.
I see. I used to compete in the Scottish Highland Games, and so I remember that was always a...
Hopefully my petition goes through and real haggis will be available once again for the first time in 50 years.
Interesting. And have you, I guess, we have obviously different countries that have different beliefs around food, things of that nature. And like you mentioned, USA is such a melting pot that you can be exposed to this depending on where you go, culture and things like that. Do you find that a lot, like I said, I wonder why it is a lot of people inherently just, you think it's a training thing? Is it a palate? Adaptability thing? So a lot of people just don't like this stuff. Just like you mentioned, when you were a kid, you didn't like liver. Why do you think that was? And what was it? What was the turning point to change you on that? Preparation or?
It's a good question. It is interesting because I see in my kids or my nieces and nephews now, like some of them like liver and some don't. And I'm a little fascinated by why that is. I think for me, some of it was the texture, some of it was the taste. I do think liver does have one of the stronger tastes of all the internal organs. Like I said before, it is when you ask the average American who doesn't eat anything unusual, what is the internal organ that people eat? Liver is the main one I think people think of. But it does have the strongest taste. It's a very irony, metallic taste that takes some getting used to. I often say I think liver's not a good first step for someone just getting introduced to offal. So I'll often recommend like a heart, which is much more similar to meat, because cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle are much more similar on the macroscopic and the microscopic level. And it doesn't have as much of an irony metallic taste. So I'll often recommend heart as being the first one. So I wonder if liver turns people off to internal organs altogether, because it does have this very strong taste. For me, it was really just learning all about the liver in medical school. What an amazing organ it is. It's 15 organs in one, sort of the metabolic powerhouse of the body, both in humans and animals. And just understanding that jiggly purple chunk of flesh in our abdomens that does all those amazing biochemical feats for us every day. It was the same liver that my relatives were eating when I was a kid. The same thing that you spread on bread and eat made me interested in trying it again. And just that fascination with how meat and organs become food made me keep trying it and get used to it, and now I love it. I do think a lot of it is just what you're used to, honestly. I think that's probably the biggest part of it.
Yeah, I've had like foie gras in France. It's delicious in my view. I want to see there's different ways to prepare that. They have the fat and the fat making receptor, so do that. But what about like various animals? Because obviously, in the U.S., if it's pig, it's chicken for the most part, maybe a little bit of that. Like, that's probably 90% person palate. You go overseas and now you're eating like weird stuff. There's people eating monkeys in Malaysia and stuff. What are your thoughts on some of these different types of animals? And you keep focus much on that?
I do focus a little bit on that. I certainly find it fascinating myself. I'd love to try meat and organs from every animal there is. I haven't tried any monkey meat or organs, but I would gladly one day. For a while, I worked in Arctic Alaska as an ER doctor, and so I got to know traditional Inupiat cuisine, which features a bunch of animals I'd never eaten before, obviously, like whales and seals and walruses and caribou as well. And their diet is very fascinating. Just like the Inuit, they ate mostly all meat diet with more than 50% of calories coming from fat. And while I was there, I did try whale meat and whale blubber and whale heart. And I got the chance to examine a whale's heart, which was the size of a yoga ball, a bowhead whale that had been hunted there by one of the whaling crews in Barrow, Alaska. And they have some various fermented walrus dishes that were interesting as well. One of the most interesting dishes I've seen, actually, the Inupiat will take a caribou's liver and actually put it into the stomach contents from the caribou's first stomach. So the rumen, the largest one, inside of it, this green, partially chewed up lichen and grass stew. And they put it in there and let the chemical, microbial, and enzymatic action of the rumen sort of act on the liver, and then they'll take it out, slice it up, and eat it. I never got the chance to try that, but I did think it was one of the more interesting anatomical dishes I've come across. But yes, trying every animal is certainly fascinating, I think. I do like to focus more on the interesting parts of the familiar animals, but I'm certainly interested in, let's say, familiar parts of unfamiliar animals or the organs of unfamiliar animals as well.
Yeah, speaking of like being up near the Arctic Circle area, I know there's some people that said that polar bear liver was something that people couldn't do well with. It was like very problematic. Maybe it's too much vitamin A or something like that. Is that something you're familiar with?
Yes, it is vitamin A, I believe. That is the issue. I never figured it quite got to the answer of why there is so much vitamin A in the polar bear liver. I presume it serves some function for them. We have vitamin A in our liver too, just not that much. And I guess something about the polar bear's biology and physiology makes it need a lot of vitamin A. Even in traditional like Inuit and Inupiat mythology, there were reasons why you shouldn't eat the polar bear liver. It was certainly known that it was poisonous, but also interestingly in the Inupiat language, the word for mushroom is basically means if you touch it, your hand will fall off. So they had some, which doesn't quite make sense because you can eat a lot of mushrooms. Yes, some are poisonous, but some of them are healthy. So it's interesting also how nutrition enters mythology and what you should eat and shouldn't eat, which is another fascinating topic about food taboos and certain parts of the animal that you shouldn't eat. Like I read that the crow, the Native Americans from the plains, the crow never ate the buffalo heart I'm not sure why, but different peoples have different taboos around different body parts, and even the way you butcher up an animal and who gets what body part and what body part is considered the most prized and what are considered the more wasteful parts that you give to people lower in the socioeconomic ladder. That's also a very fascinating aspect of cuisine and anatomy.
Yeah, I guess maybe because I think the offal or the offal was what's given to the poor. Is that like in Europe? Somewhat, I think that's where I've actually heard that. Is there some truth to that?
There is some truth. It's interesting. That also varies by culture. For instance, yes, a lot like in the U.S., a lot of the extra body parts, the pig's feet and the intestines, were given to slaves, let's say. But at the same time, even in Versailles, like in France, where the king and queen would spend their time in the palace at Versailles, some of the menus from their banquets featured tons and tons of offal and organs and liver cooked in a million different ways, and not only exotic animals, but exotic parts of all sorts of animals. So I do think there is that where certain body parts are relegated to the lower classes or to the slaves, could because they're unwanted. And in other ways, offal can be the highest form of cuisine, in the form of, let's say, some like liver mousse type dishes or things like that you can eat in France and that are really quite delicious. And sometimes it even varies by which organ and which culture. Like the lungs in Western culture, many Western cultures, the lungs were considered for the poor, but in other cultures, the lungs were considered a prized delicacy. So it really varies in a quite fascinating way across the world.
When you look back into history and look at like certain religious texts, they talk about fattening and the fatted calf and all these things, and fat being very valuable. And there's obviously organs, which fat is a significant percentage of the brain, one that comes to mind, but the bone, of course. How do you see that in different cultures, the value or like in the United States, we devalue fat. We think it's going to give us heart disease, but do we see that maybe some of these fattier things, because a lot of the organs are quite lean. I mean, the kidneys very lean, the liver's very lean, less right. It's the fatty you already. So is there a role for fat, or do you see much interest in that?
Yeah, fat, I think, is one of the more interesting body parts. And traditionally, it's been vilified in Western medicine. When I learned about nutrition in medical school, it was all about like certain kinds of fat versus other kinds of fat, avoiding the fat being responsible for so much of what ails and kills modern humans. I often tell the story about my grandmother was a Jew from Lithuania who came to the US, and she most of her life cooked in schmaltz, which is chicken fat. And then in the 60s or 70s, some doctors started telling her that was bad for her and she should instead use margarine or other kinds of artificial shortening, which have trans fats in them, because that would be much healthier, obviously. Now we know that switch was probably a terrible idea because trans fats are just about the worst thing you can ingest. And a lot of people are going back to those traditional fats that doctors told them to stop eating because they're more delicious and they're probably not as bad for you as the artificial fats. Similar story in Arctic Alaska when I spoke to some of the elders there when I was working as an ER doctor. The Inupiat elders all had stories about how doctors told them to stop eating whale blubber, stop eating seal blubber, start using vegetable oils, use whatever modern oils and fats people in the rest of the US use. And now the CDC is encouraging Inupiat and other Native Alaskans to eat more of their traditional diet. So it's, as Western medicine flip-flops on fat, I feel like that a lot of the fats people use traditionally are probably the better options, not to mention they're often more delicious. I think about when I was a resident doing primary care, and I would often tell people who are overweight with various aspects of metabolic syndrome, high blood pressure, diabetes, that they should eat more greens, but they should not use too much fat to fry them in. And it seems like an impossible task for the average American to do that. So it seems silly that I was giving them those pieces of advice at the same time. Now I'm more on the end of the spectrum where I say, if you have to drown things in fat to eat them is probably fine.
Yeah, that's so tough to choke down. Lots of fat. That's the worst anyways. But it's interesting you say that because I hadn't heard that they were encouraging the traditional First Nations or Native populations in Canada to eat more traditional. Because I had seen recently there was a Canadian, they call it a food igloo, and it was designed for like Inupiat, which is some of the territories up there in Canada. And it was like all these fruits and vegetables, which don't grow anywhere in Canada. Like, where are they getting bananas from? It doesn't grow there. So, it's interesting to see that. So, surprising to
the CDC is definitely, especially there's a CDC office in Anchorage, Alaska, that does a lot of research and public health messaging in Alaska. And they have started promoting more of the traditional diet. I think in the maybe 50s, 60s, 70s, Western doctors saw natives of the Arctic eating lots of blubber, lots of fat, and decided they should stick more to the traditional or to the sort of modern American diet. But now we see the modern American diet leads to all sorts of health problems. And so there is a lot of messaging actually in Alaska now about eating more traditional foods, lots of fish, which is very traditional, and meat from marine mammals like seals, walruses, and whales, and even some blubber. I don't know that anyone's saying go back to the 50% fat diet of pre-modern Inupiat life, but they're not saying that fat's going to kill you. And probably marine mammal fat probably is healthier than a lot of other animal fats as well.
Yeah, okay. And I know I've seen accounts of particularly on with that these people were not overweight at all. They were quite slender people. They were bundled up in tons of animal first. They looked like they were kind of squatting, but they were really quite lean. And yet they were consuming massive amounts of fat. In some ways, it helped them to maintain their body heat because it's just such a cold environment. That was almost a necessity out there. Is that something that anyone discussed with you other than why they were eating so much fat?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of people said just, we need fat. I love fat. I want to eat fat. I feel like when you spend a week or more in very cold temperatures, like camping in the winter or out snowshoeing, skiing kind of trip, I feel like your hunger for fat increases. I find I was on a 2-week snowshoeing trip in part of Canada in the winter. And I found that by the end of it, I was just taking bites of a stick of butter, which is something I would not have done in normal life. And it was just absolutely delicious and wonderful. And felt like it was keeping me warm. I spoke to a bunch of whale hunters in Barrow, Alaska. They invited me and I got the chance to go out on the ice with them in the spring whale hunting season. And they were telling me how they went to a whaling conference in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which used to be the sort of capital of the whaling industry in North America. And they went to the banquet there and they said how during lunch it was all fruits and vegetables. And this group of Inuit Eskimo were complaining, where's the meat? we're Eskimo. We need meat and fat. We can't eat this, which was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I guess I think, and obviously all sort of disagreements on this, but my understanding is, as the Western sort of societies discovered and interacted in the early 19th century, I found that these people were very robust and vigorous and healthy, free of disease largely compared to even back then. Is that the sense that you had? These people were generally pretty healthy on their native diets?
Yeah, in fact, I remember learning in medical school when we were learning about atherosclerosis and hardening of the arteries and heart attacks and strokes. The professor did mention in passing that the Inuit had, despite a diet high in animal fat, had very low rates of atherosclerosis. But it was never, I feel like it was almost mentioned in passing. It was never explored or brought up again, and no one thought too much about it. And then I remembered that when I was working there in the Arctic, that was the case. And I certainly do think like let's say the level of physical activity was incredible in ancient times. The amount of work it took to harvest a living from the Arctic Ocean is unimaginable. It's like Olympic athlete times 10. So I certainly do wonder how their traditional diet balanced with that level of physical activity compares to, let's say, a modern diet and the modern level of physical activity, which is much less. Like even on a dog sled, which they had, you're still doing a ton of work. You're often running beside the sled. You're often turning over the overturned sled or untangling dogs. It's a very physical activity, even though you might imagine it's just like riding in a car. But now, of course, they have dogless sleds in the form of snowmobiles that everyone gets around on, and cars in most parts of the Alaskan Arctic, except in the bush. I don't know the answer to that, how their traditional diet compared to traditional physical activity compares to today.
Yeah, so there's a film, Nanook of the North, that came out probably not in 1950, 40, something like that, and it is a profile of a guy named Nanook, and he was showing him, I think it was him showing him harvesting a seal, like pulling it out of the water, standing on ice, and the seal outweighs him probably twice his weight. He's manhandling anything, and he was there for basically a long period of time. So a tremendous amount of effort to harvest an animal, and just to pull it out of the water was pretty significant. And so, let me ask you have you been to Africa? Have you seen some of the stuff in Africa? I know when I was in Tanzania, and I came across some of the Maasai, they were walking around with their little leather pouch of milk and blood mixture, kind of coagulated. Well, they offered me some of that, and I smelled it and I'm like, nah, I can't do this. Have you explored Africa? Because they've got some interesting places. Well, they've got a diversity of animal talks too. They've got some really unusual animals, bear pittons, and there.
I have been to Africa and I did visit the Maasai. I did not have a chance to drink their milk and blood mixture, but I know about it, especially how they harvest it from the living cow by shooting a dart into the animal's jugular and just holding the jug or the gourd there to catch the blood. I haven't had a chance to explore Africa enough, really. But I did do actually an Anatomy Eats dinner in Oxford, Mississippi, where I worked with a Nigerian chef who did cook a bunch of Nigerian kind of inspired dishes, one with kidneys, one with liver, one with the heart. Actually, she made the heart almost like cooked it for a prolonged time in a soup until all the connective tissue broke down. I'd never seen heart cooked like that. I always see it cooked quickly or grilled but that was interesting. And so we did cook a bunch of dishes, but I haven't explored the continent enough. But I did find that Maasai dish, that Maasai kind of nutritional staple of milk and blood, interesting, because when we talk about feeding babies breast milk versus cow's milk versus formula, one of the big trouble with cow's milk is that it's low in iron. So I always think if you added some blood, that would solve that problem. So maybe milk and blood is the ultimate breast milk substitute for kids who can't breastfeed, I wonder.
Wonderful. See that in the Shelton plus strawberry milk. Because I was just seeing a post of somebody sharing one of the infant formula, and the formula ingredient was this 43% corn syrup, and then it was soybean oil is the next ingredient, and then so it was like, why would you feed our children this stuff? It just makes zero sense to me. But what about, I guess, the other parts of the world, which would be like Asia seems to, anything that moves, they'll eat over there. Is that pretty fair to say, I think? Yes,
I think even I haven't explored Asia enough, but I have been to Chinatown in Philly and New York. And one of my favorite activities is to go to a grocery store there just to look at the raw ingredients that they're selling. And I actually hired a a translator to come with me so I could ask them about the different parts. And it's quite fascinating, all the various animal parts that you see there, or even in a lot of the hot pot restaurants in Chinatown, Philly. They have just about everything on the menu there, from chicken's feet to various forms of tripe, to liver, to brain, to heart, even beef aorta, or they called it ox aorta. That was the first time I ever saw aorta, but it was basically, it almost looked like calamari because it's a rubbery tube and you can cut it into sections. And as long as you don't cook it too long, doesn't become too chewy. It's actually quite pleasant. I do think I've heard in Chinese cuisine, for instance, the sort of texture of the gelatinous texture is much more prized than it is in the US, let's say. I feel like in American cuisine, people do not like gelatinous things. I feel like even the word gelatinous sort of has this negative, gross connotation to it. But in a lot of Asian cuisines, the kind of gelatinous texture is desirable. And I think I love it too. I've gotten used to it at least. And so even gelatinous, slightly chewy aorta can be delicious.
Yeah, I think we think of gelatinous and informal Jello. It's like some blue Jello or something like that. That's about the closest we do know that. But I mean, there's, you find out, I'm blanking on the name of this, but there's this kind of a gelatinous one. You get this meat or mixed in there. I can't remember. It's like in Europe quite a bit, but in France, about there once you'd see that. It's what I'm talking about.
Like the meat kind of jellies, like an aspic is one word.
Yeah, before, yeah, exactly.
Right, the word jelly and jello and gelatin, and gelatinous obviously comes from gelatin, which you just make by boiling any collagen for a length of time and turns into jelly and gels in the fridge. It's quite delicious. Sometimes called calf's feet jelly, but only because feet have a lot of collagen. There's a lot of connective tissue between the bones of the feet and between the muscles and bones, tendons, ligaments. So you can make a jelly, though, out of any collagenous part of the body. You could take skin, which is mostly a sheet of collagen, and boil that to get gelatin.
You talked about like food taboos and then probably the opposite things that like people will think, if I consume this, gives me some sort of magic power, like, but this food is associated with this health benefit. Do you have any insight into that type of stuff?
Yeah, I do wonder about that a lot because as you said before, let's say for your brain, our brains are made of the same macromolecules, the same building blocks as an animal's brain. So wouldn't eating animal brain help your own brain? It makes perfect sense to me. I guess the doctor in me should say that I've never seen a randomized trial of people ingesting brain versus people ingesting placebo and how it affects them. But it certainly makes sense that eating that organ would help you in various ways. If you're anemic and you eat animal blood, you're getting a ton of iron, which is good for that anemia. It works out that way often. I don't know how one-to-one the correlation is. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
I'm just wondering if any particular societies will say, you hear about Eastern medicine, Chinese herbs, and I'm sure animal parts are associated with liver health and vision. And I just imagine there's got to be some folklore or belief systems around that. I would assume.
Yes, I do. I certainly think that there are about that. I think there's I wonder about, for instance, a lot of people say eating testicles will increase your testosterone, increase your virility. I went to a testicle cooking contest in Serbia, actually. My girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, was the head judge at the testicle cooking contest in Serbia. So she knows good testicles. But
she's Serbian? Is she Serbian?
No, she's from New Jersey, but just an adventurous person who somehow landed that that honor. So I went with her one year. And there, definitely the Serbians were sure that eating testicles will make you more manly. And what I learned in medical school was that sort of when you ingest testosterone, it gets processed in your liver and you don't get much of it, which is, I think, why testosterone supplements don't come as pills. They only come as injections or a foam that you put on your skin that can be absorbed that way. While estrogen, progesterone in the form of birth control pills come as tablets that you swallow because estrogen, progesterone get into your body. Testosterone doesn't. It gets processed in the liver. But the Serbians at that festival weren't interested in my scientific explanation.
Interesting. Yeah. What about, so you mentioned blood. And then I've had blood sauces like Argentinian restaurants in Overload, Miami. I had some blood. It was quite good. It's rich. I don't think you need too much of it. But what are the rules around blood in the U.S.? Because I don't, you go to the grocery store and you buy that blood there. I know you can get it, maybe. I don't think it's illegal, but do you know anything about any insight into the acquisition of blood and how it's legalized.
Yeah, there's no law against it. A lot of people I talk to about various organs and laws against them, like I mentioned before, lungs and others, assume that blood is illegal or hard to get in some way. But hard to get, I would say yes, just because the average butcher shop or grocery store doesn't carry it, but you can definitely get it. Sometimes it'll actually be, they'll add like a citric acid to it or a citrate to prevent it from clotting if it's going to be stored, and which I always found interesting because we do the same thing to blood transfusions. When you take it out of one person, it's often stored with citrate to prevent clotting before transfusing it back into another person. So animal blood used for cuisine can be stored the same way with citrate, which binds the calcium ions and prevents clotting. But you can get it. I think it's just a matter of it not being desired or widely available. But most of the chefs I've worked with, they'll often feature a blood dish, like a blood sausage, like you mentioned, or blood cookies was one that we featured actually at our cardiovascular system dinner with Anatomy Eats, because the albumin profile of blood is actually not too dissimilar from egg whites. And so you can whip it into sort of a meringue type shape. It doesn't hold its shape quite as well as egg whites do, but it does hold some of its shape when you whip it and mix it with air. Another interesting thing about whipping blood is it actually gets a brighter red when you whip it, because the hemoglobin in it is binding with oxygen. When you whip it, you're putting air all through it, and more oxygen gets to the hemoglobin. So blood will actually turn a brighter red when you whip it in that fashion, which I always found fascinating from a physiologic perspective. But yeah, blood it's just, I think a lack of desire is what makes it not available in the stores. Even when mad cow was a thing in the 90s, I believe, certain parts got harder to find, but none were really made illegal based on that. You can still find brain of most animals and you can still get blood. So maybe just a little harder to get.
Yeah, I think it's because a lot of people are under the misconception that when they eat a quote unquote bloody steak, it's not actual blood. It's just the juices just migrate, and the blood has been long drained out of the animal weeks ago. So there's not really real exposure. We get the blood and meat and any snick them out. So
right.
Let me ask this an interesting thing, because some states in the U.S. have different rules regarding like things like raw milk. A lot of people are bound not having access to raw milk. I don't know if there anything in particular opinions on that, but are there state by state variations, or is that something?
I don't know a lot about it. I guess I don't know a lot about raw milk either. I do think a lot of people who are saying raw milk is dangerous, they're thinking of raw milk from the 1890s before we had modern forms of hygiene and animal nutrition and storage technology and things like that. I certainly don't think raw milk today is going to be as dangerous as raw milk a century ago, before we had the modern food industry and ways of preserving and keeping things hygienic, or even investigating outbreaks. But I do know, like here in Pennsylvania, I know a local farm to where I am now, they get around the laws by having it be a co-op where everyone who wants to buy shares the ownership of the animal unofficially. And therefore, when they quote unquote buy it from the farmer, they're not really buying it. They're just owning a part of the animal, and they're therefore owning a part of the milk that comes out of it. I don't know a lot more about the laws, but I guess there are ways around it like that.
Yeah, I see some places sell it as quote pet milk, and you can just buy it for your pet and then turn it yourself or something like that.
Interesting.
So you've tried all these sort of, some people would consider bizarre foodstuffs throughout the world. Are there any things that you dislike or like, this ain't for me, this is just absolutely no thank you, I'll never do this again? Like the pickled shark and ice and everything's fermented. Everything's pickled away, and it's really sour. And like, this one wasn't something I enjoyed. Anything that you just said was all right, this absolutely no way, disgusting. And anything you've yet to try that you're like, I really want to try this, but I'm gonna go travel some remote part of the world to get it.
Yeah, I think I agree about the pickled shark in Iceland. That I'm glad I tried it. I'm not sure I'm eager to try it again, but I would say I definitely want to try everything once. The one thing I didn't try due to the smell was a rotten fish head soup in Kamchatka in the Russian Far East. In the north, there's a lot of quote unquote stinky foods, like the Inuit or Inupiat will bury fish heads or bury seal flipper or bury beaver tail actually, and leave it for 6 months to a year until it not really pickles, but putrefies. From what I hear, the consistency of the flesh and the consistency of the bone is the same at the end of this process. So it's one big putrefied mush. And they call these dishes like stinky beaver tail, stinky seal flipper, stinky fish head. So I guess they have something similar in the northern parts of Russia. So when I was in Kamchatka, I did have a chance to try stinky fish heads, and I did not because of the smell. Although that was 20 years ago, before I was super interested in any of these foods. So I berate my younger self for not trying it, but I think if I had the chance again, I would try it. I would love to try everything once, as long as it won't kill you.
Yeah.
As long as it's not polar bear liver, that'll kill you.
Yeah, that sort of, you see something on the menu, and the first thing it says is stinky, and I bet you're less inclined to want to eat that. Well, I understand. I think with beaver tail, and I think this goes back to early trappers, it tended to be very much high in fat, and so it was often prized for its fat content, but it wasn't was relatively lean, I think. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, that's right. Especially in the Mountain West, Montana, and such places, beaver tail was a delicacy. The beaver tail sort of gets fatter and thinner with the normal cycles of eating more, eating less. A beaver's tail would be fattier in the fall and early winter, and then slim down over the course of the winter. It's just like any other deposit of fat on the body. But yes, actually, Steve Ranella from Meat Eater has a part in his book where he talks about figuring out the beaver tail, because he just couldn't figure out what people were eating or why it was a delicacy. And he figured out this way of roasting it over the fire on a stick that made the sort of scaly surface peel off to reveal the sort of fat underneath. And he found out why they did like it.
So what's on your to-do list? Like I said, are you like, I want to go to some place and try this, or there are some things you have yet to try that you're really excited to try?
I think the two big things on my list are sort of culinary road trips through Mexico and through China. I think those are my two big things on my bucket list. In writing this, I'm writing a book about anatomy eats. Each chapter is like a different bodily system, like reproductive system, endocrine system, gastrointestinal system, and each features some exploration of cuisine around the world and some interesting dish. So I do think of sort of China and probably Japan too as one of the meccas of interesting and odd foods. So I definitely have to get there as well. And when I was in Texas last year, I got a taste of some Mexican delicacies, but I heard that in certain parts of Mexico, there are some very interesting foods, spinal cord kebabs and things like that I look forward to trying.
I was in Peru and I have a dish called cuy, which is basically guinea pig. It's basically guinea pig served whole like this with claws or something. They're like, yeah, you go. And it's got little ugly potatoes around it. But I remember having it was really chewy and dry, and I didn't really. It was all that great. Have you been down to South America and seen that they've got some obviously different cuisine as well?
I have been a little bit. I haven't explored. I've been to South America a few times, but haven't explored it in a culinary way, unfortunately. I feel like a lot of times when you're traveling or abroad and you try some interesting meat, it's often that individual specimen might be cooked in not the best way. Maybe it was overcooked, maybe it wasn't spiced well or something like that. And then it's dry or gross or chewy, and you just assume that meat is that way always. But I feel like in the hands of a master chef, pretty much anything could be delicious. When I was in Russia, I had some brown bear that was absolutely terrible. And I thought, I guess brown bear meat's just terrible. But later in Alaska, I had some other that was delicious. It's very variable, and people shouldn't write off one organ or one kind of meat forever if they have one bad meal with it.
Yeah, my understanding around the bear is because they're the monogastric animals. Their meat is flavored very highly by what they've been recently eating. It depends on the time of year. If they're eating a lot of fish, the meat tastes a bit more fishy. If they're eating berries, it tastes sweeter. That's what I've been told. It's tried there. They need to know. I like it simple. Kind of an interesting, interesting deal there.
Black bear meat is wonderful, at least from here in Pennsylvania. Once a doctor who was on his way to relieve me, my shift was over, his was starting, actually hit a bear accidentally on the road and called out his cousin, the butcher, to deal with it. And I got a bunch of roasts and ground bear meat. That was delicious.
Yeah, actually, the black bears walking on my house. That's one in our neighborhood. I'm out there in Washington State, and I've seen him all. We've seen him walk that yard before, so out there. So many ones over on Google. We are just about out of time. I appreciate it's been a really interesting perspective. And where would people go if they want to find out more? Do you have a website or a social media account or something like that? People are interested in these sort of various delicacies.
Yep. So I'm at Anatomy Eats on Instagram and Twitter, or I would say are my two most active. And then I post non-food doctor things at John Reisman, MD on the same platforms. But for the food, it's Anatomy Eats, and you can go to anatomyeats.com as well.
Dr. Reisman, it's been fun. It's been an interesting discussion. So anyway, good luck to you, and I hope you can try all these interesting things, and maybe we can expand the palate of the average person, because there's a lot of stuff out there for shit. Thank you very much.
Thank you,